In the dead of night, Jerusalem's sacred hills glowed with unholy fire. The cries of infants pierced the air, and the smoke of pagan sacrifice rose where God's name was once praised. A king stood before the flames, not as a servant of heaven, but as a worshipper of demons. He was once the son of a righteous ruler, a child of promise. Yet, intoxicated by power and darkness, he fell deeper than any king before him. His name was Manasseh, and his descent into evil was so vile that even the prophets trembled. But what happened next defied all human reason. Tonight, we uncover the terrifying yet redemptive journey of Manasseh, the king who opened the gates of hell, and later became a living symbol of God's mercy. This is not just ancient history. It is a mirror of our own souls of pride, rebellion, and the shocking grace that waits on the other side. To understand the darkness, we must first remember the light that came before it. 1. The fall of the heir. He was only 12 years old when the crown touched his head, too young to rule, too fragile to resist the whispers that slithered through the palace. The kingdom mourned King Hezekiah, a righteous man whose prayers had once turned death aside and whose faith had saved Jerusalem. Yet even as the incense of mourning filled the air, another scent rose from the shadows, the smell of rebellion. At first, the new king seemed uncertain, a boy drowning beneath the weight of his father's legacy. But temptation has a voice, and it rarely shouts. It whispers. Courtiers from foreign lands promised him knowledge older than prophets, secret rituals of power, gods who demanded no obedience, only devotion. They told him his father's God was too strict, too jealous, too small. Manasseh listened. Curiosity turned to pride. Pride became hunger. Within months, the sacred courtyards of Jerusalem echoed with foreign chants. Pagan idols stood where priests once prayed. The very altars that Hezekiah had smashed were rebuilt by his own son's command. Smoke from forbidden incense curled toward heaven, carrying the stench of betrayal. 2 Kings 21:2 says, "He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord." Yet this was more than disobedience, it was defiance. The boy who had watched his father kneel in prayer now stood before idols, summoning power he did not understand. The prophet Isaiah appeared one final time, his voice trembling with divine warning. The Lord will not remain silent forever. But the king laughed, his heart hardened by the illusion of control. And so the light of Judah began to fade. The crown that once symbolized God's covenant had become a curse, and the child who should have led his people to glory was leading them into darkness. 2. The kingdom of shadows. It began with a whisper, but now the entire city roared with corruption. Jerusalem, the city of God, had become a playground for demons. At night, the palace trembled with the sound of drums and chanting. Fires burned on every hill, casting the shape of idols across the city walls. The king, who once prayed to heaven, now danced before altars built for darkness. 2 Kings 21:5 says, "He built altars to all the host of heaven in the 2 courts of the house of the Lord." The unimaginable had happened. The very temple, once filled with the presence of God, now reeked of blood, incense, and sin. Inside the holy place, a statue of a foreign god stood where the Ark of the Covenant had once rested. The people, confused and terrified, watched their leader worship the very forces their ancestors had fought against. Prophets rose up to confront him. Isaiah, old and weary, appeared one final time, declaring that the cries of the innocent reached the throne of heaven. But Manasseh's heart was stone. He silenced the prophets, imprisoned the priests, and filled the streets with fear. Those who resisted vanished in the night. The holy city became a kingdom of shadows. Blood ran through its streets like a second river. Families who refused to kneel before idols fled into caves, whispering prayers in the dark. The land that once sang psalms of deliverance now groaned under the weight of sin. And yet, above the smoke, heaven still watched. For every cry of anguish, there was still an echo of mercy waiting to be heard. But Manasseh could not hear it, not yet. The darkness he unleashed had become his kingdom, and soon it would consume him entirely. 3. The prophecy of chains. The night was silent, too silent. The stars above Jerusalem flickered like dying candles, as if the heavens themselves refused to watch what was unfolding below. Manasseh's palace, once a place of glory, had become a temple of chaos. Inside, the young king surrounded himself with foreign priests and occult symbols carved into gold and bone. He believed he was untouchable, favored by dark powers. But the higher a man builds his throne on sin, the deeper he will fall. One night, during a ritual meant to summon spirits of wisdom, something unexpected happened. The fire on the altar turned black, and a voice echoed through the chamber, not from below, but from above. The king who abandons his God shall be abandoned by his power. In chains he will be taken, in tears he shall return. The words chilled every soul present. But Manasseh, trembling, forced a smile and dismissed it as illusion. The next day, he ordered greater sacrifices to silence his fear. Yet the prophecy haunted his dreams. He saw himself bound in bronze chains, dragged through the streets by foreign soldiers. He awoke in terror, but his pride was stronger than his fear. To prove his defiance, he commanded an even darker alliance with the Assyrians, the cruelest empire of his age. But alliances with darkness come at a price. His Assyrian friends watched his weakness grow. They flattered him by day and plotted by night. The king who once controlled nations was now controlled by lies. As the drums of war echoed in the distance, Jerusalem's sky darkened once more. The prophecy was no longer a warning, it was a countdown. The man who had summoned demons would soon discover that the chains he feared were already waiting for him. 4. The chains of judgment. The feast began with laughter, but it ended with screams. Manasseh sat on his throne, surrounded by Assyrian envoys who raised golden cups in his honor. Music filled the air. Dancers twirled before the blazing torches, and the king's pride gleamed brighter than the jewels on his crown. But in the midst of the revelry, a shadow moved among the guests. The Assyrian commander, silent and patient, waited for the signal. Then came the sound metal striking stone. In an instant, the celebration became chaos. The very men Manasseh had trusted unsheathed their swords. The king who once ruled with an iron hand now trembled like a prisoner. His guards were cut down. The envoys revealed their true allegiance. The alliance he had built on lies was collapsing around him. 2 Chronicles 33-11 records it clearly. The Lord brought against them the army of the king of Assyria, who captured Manasseh with hooks, bound him with bronze chains, and took him to Babylon. The prophecy had been fulfilled. Dragged through the streets of his own city, the proud king was jeered by the very people he had oppressed. His royal robes were torn. His crown lay crushed in the dirt. In Babylon, the darkness was different. There were no chants, no altars, only silence. The same hands that had lifted idols now trembled in the cold of a prison cell. For the first time in years, the voices that surrounded him were gone. Only his thoughts remained, and they screamed louder than any demon. The man who had summoned spirits now faced the one spirit he could not control. Judgment had come not from enemies or empires, but from heaven itself. And in the deepest pit of despair, something unexpected began to stir, a whisper of grace. 5. The prisoner's prayer. The once great king of Judah now sat alone in darkness. His cell in Babylon was cold and damp, the stench of decay thick in the air. The man who had commanded armies and defied prophets was now surrounded only by rats and silence. For the first time, no counselors whispered lies, no idols promised power, only the echo of his own guilt. Every night, the same memories haunted him, the screams of the innocent, the smoke of altars burning before false gods, the blood of his own son offered to demons. Each image tore deeper into his soul until his arrogance shattered completely. He remembered his father, Hezekiah's steady voice in prayer, his words of trust in the God of Israel. Somewhere, deep inside, something began to break. 2 Chronicles 33-12 says, "In his distress he sought the favor of the Lord his God, and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. That night, Manasseh fell to his knees. His chains clanged against the stone floor as he whispered, "Lord, I have sinned beyond measure. My hands are stained, my heart is hollow. But if you still hear, if your mercy still lives, remember me." He did not ask for freedom. He asked for forgiveness, and heaven listened. No fire appeared, no angel descended. But a peace fell upon him, quiet, profound, undeniable. The same God he had rejected now reached into his darkness. The same mercy he had mocked wrapped around him like light breaking through a tomb. In time, his captors released him, though none could explain why. The king returned to his land not as a conqueror, but as a redeemed man. The tyrant had died in Babylon. The servant of God had risen in his place. 6. The return of the redeemed. The people could hardly believe their eyes when they saw him. Manasseh, the king who had been dragged away in chains, now walking through the gates of Jerusalem once more. But the man who returned was not the same one who had left. His proud gaze was gone. His crown, tarnished by sin, no longer defined him. Instead, his eyes held something no one expected: peace. The first thing he did was not rebuild his throne, but kneel before the altar of the Lord. The same hands that once built idols now tore them down. He ordered every pagan shrine destroyed, every false image burned, every altar of darkness shattered. The idols that had once enslaved his heart were now crushed beneath his feet. 2 Chronicles 33-15:16 says, "He removed the foreign gods and the image from the temple of the Lord, and restored the altar of the Lord, and sacrificed peace offerings and thank offerings on it." The sound of worship once again filled the city. Jerusalem, once drenched in despair, began to breathe again. But redemption does not erase the past, it transforms it. Some still doubted him. Some whispered that his repentance was too late. Yet Manasseh didn't seek approval. Day by day, he rebuilt not just walls, but hearts. He cared for the widows his cruelty had created. He fed the poor who once feared his name. He ruled not as a tyrant, but as a servant. The same city that had once echoed with cries of fear now rang with songs of forgiveness. Manasseh's life became a living testimony that even the darkest soul can find light again. And when he finally died, he wasn't remembered as the king who summoned demons, but as the sinner whom God restored. Conclusion. The light beyond the darkness. From the throne to the dungeon, from arrogance to repentance, King Manasseh's life stands as one of Scripture's most powerful testaments to God's mercy. He was a man who walked through the deepest night and still found the dawn. His story proves that no heart is too hardened, no sin too great, and no past too broken for the grace of God to redeem. What began as rebellion ended as renewal, because even when humanity turns its back, heaven still waits with open arms. Manasseh's story mirrors the struggle of every believer. We all build idols, ambition, pride, desire, and we all face moments when we forget the voice of truth. Yet, God's mercy is not a distant memory, it's a living promise. The same God who forgave Manasseh still calls to us through conscience, through suffering, through second chances. The Church teaches that repentance is not the end of judgment, but the beginning of healing. When we turn back, even from our darkest sins, we don't just find forgiveness, we find purpose. The scars of our rebellion become the symbols of grace. If this story has stirred something within you, take a moment tonight to reflect. What idols have you built? What chains have you allowed to bind your soul? God does not ask for perfection, He asks for surrender. Like Manasseh, you can rise again. You can tear down what once enslaved you and build something sacred in its place. Share this message, not just with words, but with your life. Comment below. I choose mercy over pride. Like, share, and help others rediscover the hope that no sin is final and that grace is stronger than any past.